Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir has held a meeting with Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani in Doha. Bashir's visit to the Gulf state comes during the longest anti-government protests of his time in office. He's facing nearly daily demonstrations calling for an end to his 30-year rule. Well, Sudan's Labour Minister says the government's working to start a dialogue with the demonstrators.
We are all required to exert more efforts in the coming days, and this should include attempts to find common grounds with the youths protesting. It is known that they took to the streets as a spontaneous response to the government's failures. They have no clear-cut political affiliations. It is therefore our duty as a state authority to find channels of communication with them to find common solutions.
Jamal El-Shayal has more from the office of Qatar's Emir here in Doha.
This is the first foreign trip to be made by President Omar al-Bashir since those protests that have erupted in his country escalated over the past few weeks. The fact that he chose to visit Qatar is telling. Doha and Khartoum have a strong history between them. Doha sponsored and hosted the Darfur peace talks, for example. It's invested or made billions of dollars worth of investments over the years, and often there has been an alignment between Qatar's vision for the region when it comes to significant issues like, for example, Palestine, and that of Sudan as well. Speaking to Al Jazeera, the Sudanese foreign minister said that this was, or he described the meeting between President Omar al-Bashir and Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani as a brotherly meeting. He said that they would discuss regional issues and that the protests in Sudan were too small of a topic to be the focus of these bilateral discussions. Having said that, however, they are significant protests. They are the longest protests that have taken place since Omar al-Bashir came to power roughly 30 years ago. We are talking about more than 40 people killed, widespread condemnation from around the world as to how the security services and the Sudanese government have treated those protesters. But in summation, as far as Omar al-Bashir is concerned, he wants to show that he's still very much a statesman, still very much in control, and he has no issue leaving the country to visit other world leaders, assured, he believes, to come back with still in power. So a significant trip in the sense that there is a lot to discuss between these two governments, but tight-lipped both sides have been with regards to revealing as to what they've agreed on, if there have been any deals, and how to move forward.
Heba Morgan has more now from the capital, Khartoum.
People in Sudan have been demonstrating for 5 weeks now. They say they want the president to step down and hand over power to an interim independent council. Now, it all started with the economy, but people are saying now that the reason why the economy is in a downward spiral is because of President Bashir and his 30-year rule. They say that the government has ruled with widespread corruption and that there was no improvement during his time in office, and that the only thing that could improve the situation now, despite his promises to try to introduce economic reforms and raise salaries for civil workers, is not the incentives that he's offering or the promises that he's making, but to rather see him step down. Now, people are saying that his promises are something they've heard over and over again, and they don't believe that he can really produce concrete change. And let's remember, he doesn't have the same economic incentives or the economic power that he had back in 2011. When South Sudan seceded in 2011, it took with it 75% of the country's oil reserves, which was the main source of GDP for Sudan. So for him to try to introduce economic reforms is not going to produce as much results as he would like to see, because there is simply no way for Sudan to try to bring in more hard currency to try to sustain its economy. People are also criticizing the government for the use of what they have termed as excessive brutal force. The protesters who have been out on the streets demonstrating say they came out in peace, they are unarmed, and they're trying to voice their frustration against the government, but instead have been met with tear gas and live ammunition. Now, people are saying despite the security threats and that they're putting their lives at risk, they will continue to demonstrate until the president steps down, something he said he's not going to do until elections come next year.
Thailand's king has issued a royal decree endorsing the first general elections since a 2014 military coup. The elections will now be held on March 24. Voting's been delayed several times by the military, which has clamped down on dissent and free speech. Scott Heidler has more from the capital, Bangkok.
It's been a long time in coming, but the election day here in Thailand has finally been set, March 24th. Now, two announcements coming out on Wednesday confirming that. First, from the royal household, a royal decree declaring that the elections were okay to move forward. Then a few hours after that, the election commission coming out and confirming that March 24th will be Election Day. Now, there's been a lot of confusion, particularly over these last couple of weeks, because at the beginning of the year, the Election Commission came out and said most likely the election would take place on February 24th, but then the government said that had to be postponed because they need to prepare, the government needs to prepare for the coronation of the king in May. There was a bit back and forth. We saw a little bit of protesting on the streets here over the weekends the last couple of weeks, but again today, Wednesday, confirmed March 24th will be the election day. Now, over the last couple of weeks, bans have been lifted on political parties for organizing and fundraising, so they've started the wheels moving toward this election day. But now, since we know what the date is going to be, those political parties are going to start to move forward with campaigning. And also we know that those who are going to be running for members of parliament positions, they will register themselves over the next couple of weeks. So now the date is set and the mechanisms will start to move for Thailand to have its first elections since the coup back in 2014.
Well, the election date announcement came as two bodies of anti-government activists were found in the Mekong River. They were among dozens of dissidents who fled the country after the coup. Wayne Hay reports from Bangkok.
Mutilated, bound and wrapped, the bodies were found on the banks of the Mekong River in northeastern Thailand. Police confirmed their identities.
As for the DNA results, we have received the formal result from the forensic department of the police hospital.
They were anti-monarchy and anti-government activists known as Pushana and Kasalong. After a 2014 coup in Thailand, they fled to neighbouring Laos, where they disappeared from their homes in December, along with the man they worked for, Surichai Seidan. Surichai regularly posted online videos and comments critical of the military government and monarchy. At least two other critics have gone missing from Laos in recent years, leading to the accusation from dissidents that this is the work of the military, whose stated aim is to defend the monarchy. But Thai officials say they weren't involved in the disappearances. The discovery of the bodies comes as Thailand prepares for the coronation of the king in May. Criticising or defaming the monarchy carries a jail term of up to 15 years for each count. Hundreds of people have left Thailand before being arrested and are now living as fugitives. Neti Wichiansen fled more than 8 years ago.
They told me they're going to search to find the evidence in my laptop and hard drive how many cases they're going to charge me with the lesbianicity law. So at that time, I know that if they search around, they're going to find many cases.
Thai authorities say they'll work with their Lao counterparts to investigate the murders. But given who they were and the nature of their disappearance and death, the families may be waiting a long time for justice. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Bangkok.
A car bomb has exploded in the northern Syrian city of Afrin. It happened near a base for a rebel group that's backed by Turkey. Ahrar al-Sharqiyya is allied with the Free Syrian Army. At least 3 of its fighters were killed. Sullivan Javaid has more now from Gaziantep at the Turkey-Syria border.
This attack targeted a group called Ahrar al-Sharqiyya, associated with the Free Syrian Army backed by Turkish forces. These are the forces who've been carrying out the operation east of Euphrates, predominantly against Kurdish fighters. The city of Afrin is now more or less controlled by these fighters, and they have been in charge for a number of months now. This is not just the only attack that has happened in the last couple of days. There's been uptick of violence inside Syria. Just yesterday we saw a car bombing in Latakia, a government-held area. And the day before, we saw an attack on US-led Kurdish forces in the province of Hasakeh. There is a lot of political developments that have been happening, including the one that is happening today, as a meeting continues between the Russian president and his Turkish counterpart on the future of Syria and the role of Russian and Turkish forces as they try and draw a map towards peace.
The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is due to hold talks with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin on Syria. They're trying to find common ground despite backing opposing sides in the war. US plans to withdraw its troops presents yet another challenge or opportunity. Well, shortly we'll talk to Rory Challens live in Moscow, but first, here's his report.
Turkey has been sending reinforcements to its border with northern Syria recently. It's got forces in the last rebel stronghold of Idlib province and in Aleppo province, where Turkey is facing off against the US-backed Kurdish-dominated SDF in the northeast. And Donald Trump's decision to pull US troops out of Syria means foreign powers involved in the war are reassessing their positions. Last September, Turkey and Russia struck a deal. Russia called off a threatened government assault on Idlib, and together they created a demilitarized zone with Turkey responsible for making rebel groups pull back into Idlib's interior. But as Turkey's president meets Vladimir Putin in Moscow on Wednesday, the sands are shifting again.
Moscow expects that vast territory that the SDF controlled with the help of the United States, the Syrian government will take over. Turkey, however, is hoping that it can have a small buffer on the border with Turkey that it might control and kind of prevent the Kurdish elements from infiltrating that area. That is, of course, changing the status quo for both of them, but I think that's the main disagreement as well, because Russia does not agree with Turkey's ambition to establish a buffer zone on the border.
For the thousands of refugees shivering in Idlib's camps, it's been a grim winter of cold and floods. And away from the cameras, other developments could mean further trouble for civilians. Formerly Al-Qaeda-linked Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has almost totally taken over Idlib from other rebel groups. Turkey seemed too distracted by its Kurdish problems to do much to stop this. And Russia perhaps sees it as an opportunity, despite it and many other countries calling HTS terrorists.
And Rory joins me live now from Moscow. Rory, so both leaders have a lot to talk about on Syria, but are they likely to strike some kind of deal, do you think?
Well, I think that's the big question. I mean, obviously there was this deal that they did over Idlib last year, which staved off a government offensive on the province, on the rebel stronghold there, which would have been supported by Russian air power. Russia has always said that that was a temporary situation anyway, but with Turkey looking now to the northeast and to its Kurdish problems, there is perhaps a potential for a new deal to be done between Russia and Turkey. That's what Syria watchers like Yuri Barmin, who you heard in my reports, think might be on the cards. Basically, Russia and Turkey saying to each other, okay, Turkey, you can have a buffer zone in the northeast. We don't particularly like it, but you can have that if Russia and the Syrian government are allowed to do what they want with Idlib, which is basically to take it over and finally crush HTS once and for all, return Idlib to government hands. So we'll have to wait, I think, and see what Erdogan and Putin talk about later to see whether that really is the kind of deal that is actually being discussed.
Rory, thank you. All right, lots more still to come here in Al Jazeera, including...
We want our pay!
Tell Congress that we are here to stay!
The US Senate will try once again to end the longest partial government shutdown in American history. Also,
I'm always concerned about his safety.
the wife of a missing Sudanese activist appeals for his release as the president makes his first trip abroad since protests began a month ago. More on that. Stay